God, we're really talking about the ugly reality of human behaviour when we start sharing the stories of both individual harassments that, and I know there's probably not a person in this chamber that hasn't, but I'm really, really sorry to hear of the length of harassment that you're going through, and I really wish you success, if not with the current legislation, which I think is abysmal, but with this new legislation I hope you can bring it to fruition and a happy outcome for yourself. But there isn't anybody in this House, or indeed our local government colleagues, or our Dáil colleagues, or indeed probably anybody in any walk of life, that in some medium that we call the wonderful world of social media and the great invention that is the internet hasn't suffered in some way, shape or form. And this legislation is going to go, if not the full way, a long way of addressing a lot of the concerns that we have. There are two aspects to it. One is the sharing of images, which was probably really, really highlighted to us all in stark reality of how harmful it can be only a couple of weeks ago when we saw that dump of tens of thousands of very personal images that caused great hurt and particularly exercised the young women in Ireland. Well, indeed it did in my household anyway, but I really, really welcome that. But I want to talk about the other aspect of the bill, the harmful and harassment and bullying aspect of it. And whilst the legislation is very, very welcome, and particularly the penalties are very, very welcome, I really don't believe that we really fully appreciate to the extent of where it's going to go, because I think when we hear about people being bullied, we think they're being bullied by a certain stereotype person that we have in our head. And I think we think they're all adults. And I think we think they're all in a box that when we do shine a light on them and we find and point the finger at them who they actually are, that the 2-year sentences will be well justified and it'll be grand and everything will be great. But I can only speak, we talked this morning about politics being about the personal, and so I can only speak about the personal experiences that I've had with regard to bullying. And they're not adults, because when we had an incident in my house a couple of years ago that was greatly helped by schools and by the police and whatever, but there was no happy outcome because the bullies were 13 and 14-year-old girls. And the viciousness and the relentlessness of these 13 and 14-year-old girls, when you look them in the eye in front of their mammies and daddies where butter wouldn't melt in their mouth and they're really, really sorry, but when you read back to them the Snapchat messages that are again relentless, and I know Jared said earlier on that it's awful for a parent to let their child go to bed. In some cases, when your child is being bullied, it's the only friend that they have, and I know that doesn't make sense, but when you're in the throes of your child that you love the bones of, and not being able to help them because what you want to do and in order to help them isn't probably legal, you're left with absolutely no tools in your kit. Because the 14-year-old, 13-year-old child doesn't actually realise the damage, the psychological harm that they're actually doing to the child that they're bullying. And I'm not sure that this legislation, welcome and all as it is, and I really mean that, is actually going to fix that problem. And so I am encouraged by you, Minister, and particularly Minister McEntee, when you say that there is a need for educational programmes, when you say that there is a need for awareness. Because it isn't just the 14-year-old or 13-year-old child that needs to be made aware of how harmful the communications that they're snapping at 1 and 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning because they don't go away, and the harmful impacts that they have on another 13-year-old child's psyche. We end up doing the full circle of why we're all here today is because a young woman, and there are plenty more like her, but we all know this girl by name today, a young woman wasn't able to cope with the harmful communications that she was receiving relentlessly. And she did take her own life. But it's because of the ferociousness of her mother and the unwillingness of her mother allowing those people to get off the hook that we're all here today, celebrating a young woman's very, very short life, but a legacy that will obviously live long, long, long after this legislation is passed today. And it is absolutely right and fitting that it is called Coco's Law in her honour. I'm really not sure that this is going to do the trick, and so that's why I am so glad that it isn't a solid and standalone piece of legislation. But it isn't something that's to be put in a drawer or on a shelf and we'll get back to it in a few years' time, because I absolutely believe when we start to monitor the bullying online that we will now start to be able to do because of this piece of legislation, we'll also be able to start to measure it. And I tell you, the ugly reality of that, the perpetrators of this are not some awful men and women that have no feelings. Because in an awful lot of cases we're going to discover that they're children who just don't realise the harm that they're actually doing. And that's an even bigger problem that I think we need to address. I want to add to the cloud that Brendan Howland is probably travelling home to on today, because it's so well deserved. When I had the privilege of being a minister, one of the first and often things I used to say during legislation is that no government minister or no official in a department has a monopoly on a wisdom. And this is a perfect example of how that's so true. So thank you, Brendan, thank you, Labour, and thank you to everybody else that has cooperated in getting this bill passed. But this is only the beginning. It absolutely isn't going to fix the problem that we're unearthing, because I really do believe when we actually properly take the ugly face of the problem that we're talking about, we're all going to be so ashamed of the society, of the communities, of the children that we're rearing, and that's not true of all of us, but it's definitely true, obviously, of some.